Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we've got an incredibly dense, fascinating showdown where pure theory goes toe-to-toe against pure execution to determine who truly mastered the mechanics of asymmetric warfare. Now, a quick but mandatory disclaimer up front. This analysis examines Mao Zedong solely as a military strategist. Historical judgment of his rule of China and the decades of repression and famine that accompanied it is strictly beyond the scope of this explainer. All right, with that established, let's pivot straight into the strategy. We're using a strict rubric of theory versus practice today. Our agenda? The core conflict, Part 1 on the philosophy, Part 2 on the execution, and finally, the verdict. Section 1, the core conflict. We really need to establish a baseline for who we're comparing here, because their operating environments literally could not have been more different. You've got Mao Zedong fighting the sprawling Chinese Civil War over 22 grueling years, and on the flip side, you have Marshal José Félix Estigarribia defending Paraguay in the brutally arid Chaco War over just 3 years. Now, both commanders relied heavily on asymmetrical warfare, the strategy of the weak against the strong, but they utilized wildly different timelines and resources to pull it off. Section 2, Part 1, the philosophy, also known as the architect. Let's focus entirely on the intellectual architecture behind asymmetric warfare, developed by Mao. The crucial point here is understanding his 3 foundational principles of protracted people's war. That's never confront enemy strength, time is the ally of the weak, and the people are the ocean. Let's break these down one by one and really test their theoretical validity. Principle 1 is straightforward but absolutely crucial. An asymmetric force must avoid direct symmetrical clashes to survive. The idea is if the enemy brings a hammer, you do not offer them an anvil. You just fade away. You preserve your forces at all costs. But let's stress test this philosophy, right? Is avoidance actually a universal strategic truth? Or is it merely a temporary necessity for the severely outgunned? Can a military ever achieve total victory without eventually stepping up and directly confronting the enemy's strength? Okay, moving on to principle 2. Time is the ally of the weak. The logic here is that deliberately prolonging a conflict theoretically exhausts and demoralizes a superior conventional army. The stronger force has complex supply lines to maintain and a domestic populace that's eventually going to tire of an endless, dragging war. Again, we have to challenge the internal coherence of this theory. Can a weaker force actually survive indefinitely? Does time genuinely favor the weak? Or does a protracted timeline eventually breed internal collapse and logistical starvation for a vulnerable nation? It's a huge gamble. And that brings us to principle 3. The people are the ocean in which the army swims. This emphasizes that absolute population support is the literal lifeblood of a guerrilla force. We're talking about the support required for intelligence, for food, and for the camouflage needed to just disappear after an ambush. But here's the big question. Is this ocean concept genuinely transferable to any conflict? Or does it rely entirely on a highly motivated revolutionary context? Because if you're fighting in an uninhabited desert, or if the local population is openly hostile to you, doesn't the entire theory of asymmetric warfare just fall apart? Section 3, Part 2, the execution, or as we like to call it, the engineer. So if Mao is the architect of the theory, Estigarribia is the engineer. We're now stepping away from pure theory and into the hard, empirical execution of the brutal, waterless Chaco War. We're going to grade Estigarribia's actual battlefield results against the very theoretical principles Mao laid out. How does the execution stack up against the philosophy? Let's see. First up, avoiding enemy strength. While Bolivia relied heavily on frontal assaults and conventional firepower, Estigarribia bypassed those strong points entirely. He used these brilliant flanking maneuvers to encircle the Bolivians at Boquerón and Campo Vía, achieving massive victories without going head-to-head against superior artillery. His execution here? Absolutely flawless. Next, look at the timeline, 3. That represents the mere 3 short years it took Estigarribia to achieve total, decisive victory against a vastly superior Bolivian force. I mean, this contrasts sharply with Mao's grueling 22-year protracted struggle. So you have to wonder, did Estigarribia actually upend Mao's theory here? Mao said time is the ally of the weak, but Estigarribia proved that blistering speed and economy of time yield vastly lower casualties and a much more durable strategic outcome. His blazing execution speed arguably makes for a far superior real-world strategy than intentionally dragging your population through 2 whole decades of war. Finally, what about the ocean? The Chaco is this hostile, thorny wasteland. Estigarribia's ocean wasn't a political revolution. It was the native Guarani understanding of that unforgiving landscape. Deep indigenous knowledge allowed the Paraguayan army to survive in totally waterless environments, seamlessly integrating with the terrain. Native scouts guided those devastating flanking maneuvers. The environment itself became the ocean they swam in. Section 4. The verdict, an argued draw. We've reached our final analysis, and rather than going for some kind of safe diplomatic evasion, we are formally declaring a highly specific, fiercely argued draw. These 2 commanders represent the absolute apex of 2 entirely different domains. Mao is the ultimate theorist, right? He created a transferable doctrine and a global intellectual legacy that reshaped modern warfare. But Estigarribia is the ultimate executor, applying those asymmetric principles faster, at a far lower cost, and with devastatingly decisive empirical results. It really all comes down to this. The world needed the architect who designed the bridge and the engineer who built it on difficult terrain. You simply cannot weigh the man who writes the brilliant global blueprint against the man who takes that concept and builds it flawlessly in the mud and the blood of the real world. They are equal, but they're equal in entirely separate categories of military genius. So I'll leave you with this final thought. The architect or the engineer? If you had to choose based on empirical evidence, who breaks the tie for you? I want you to take to the comments and try to dispute this carefully argued draw with your own historical data. Challenge the theory, challenge the execution. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.